For generations, the armored knight looked like the answer to every battlefield question.
Steel covered the body, wealth covered the steel, and confidence rode above them both.
A knight was not only a man in armor, but a system of horse, rank, training, and impact.
Once armor improved, many familiar blows stopped meaning what they used to mean.
When the sword no longer felt enough, Europe began asking harder questions.
The reply was not one weapon, but an education in how to break, bypass, or unmake the knight.
The weapons that threaten power most effectively are often the least interested in beauty.
This is the story of how the battlefield stopped admiring armor and started studying its weaknesses.
To defeat the knight, Europe first had to understand what made him terrifying. A knight was never only an armored body. He was also horse, servants, equipment, and money in motion.
Height made the knight harder to reach, speed made him harder to stop, and armor made him harder to punish.
Before impact, the knight won battles partly by what men imagined the impact would be.
Many infantry failures began before the horse arrived, inside the body rather than on the ground.
The knight represented not only violence, but a social order that expected to survive by it.
For a long time, much of Europe began with fewer resources than the knight did. Weapons that had once worked well enough now met protection that changed their meaning.
Against some enemies, the sword still ruled, but against the knight, it had to work much harder for less certainty.
To kill knights, men had to stop fighting the old battle in their heads.
The first lesson was simple. A knight cannot be killed if he cannot first be endured.
The first great counter to the knight was not refinement, but distance placed into ordinary hands.
Cheap, teachable, and long enough to threaten before fear fully matured, the spear became the common answer to elite speed.
It did not need noble beauty. It only needed to make a horse hesitate and a rider think.
The spear mattered because many men could learn enough of it fast enough.
Cavalry terror depended on animal trust. The spear existed to break that trust. If the horse slows or veers, the knight loses the first thing that made him frightening.
Killing knights did not always begin with killing them. Sometimes it began with ruining the shape of their attack.
A knight on foot is still dangerous, but he is no longer a moving tower.
As Europe understood distance better, the spear lengthened into something even more difficult for cavalry to solve.
A pike was less a single weapon than a collective decision not to yield the ground in front of it.
The pike taught Europe that knights could be answered not with equal nobility, but with superior formation.
It demanded courage from ordinary men, but it rewarded them with collective power against elite fear.
Countering knights did not mean making them harmless. It meant making them answerable.
Once cavalry was slowed, Europe needed weapons that could do more than merely keep it away.
The bill was feared because it could disturb a knight's position before it tried to injure him.
A knight is less frightening once his balance no longer belongs fully to him.
If the pike controlled distance, the halberd exploited what distance control made possible. Europe learned that knights were easiest to kill when a weapon punished several kinds of failure at once.
A slowed knight is dangerous. A knight allowed to recover space is dangerous again.
By now, the anti-knight lesson is becoming clear. One weapon starts the solution, another continues it.
If knights were deadly up close, Europe also learned to threaten them sooner.
The crossbow changed the psychology of armor by making fear travel farther than a sword could.
Knights did not need to be pierced every time. They only needed to stop trusting distance. The crossbow taught Europe that a machine could make the elite cautious.
Knights learned to fear what could threaten them before they could answer it with their own reach.
Once knights could be slowed, stopped, or unhorsed, Europe turned to weapons that argued directly with the body inside the steel. The mace did not need to cut plate to matter. It needed to make armor a less complete comfort. Armor reduces injury, but it cannot erase momentum or panic.
When the knight's world became too close for elegance, blunt weapons became brutally persuasive.
If the mace spoke broadly to armor, the hammer tried to make the conversation sharper.
Europe learned that concentrated force and concentrated fear often travel together.
Knights were hardest to kill when they were grand, and easiest to kill when battle became inconveniently close.
Once the principle was understood, shapes multiplied to answer slightly different forms of armor and fear.
Once unhorsed, the knight enters the kind of fight where armor protects him and traps him at the same time.
For armored foot combat, Europe produced one of its most complete anti-knight answers in the poleaxe.
The poleaxe was feared because it did not depend on one perfect opportunity.
In elite foot combat, the problem of killing knights became refined into technique without becoming less brutal. Europe learned that knights were easier to finish once their timing and posture failed first.
The knight was not an unbroken shell. He was a puzzle of protected plates and necessary weaknesses.
Some swords adapted by abandoning broad cutting confidence and becoming weapons for gaps instead. The Estak reveals the battlefield's lesson in steel. Precision matters more than romance when armor matures.
Europe did not only invent new tools, it also taught older weapons harsher manners. Against a knight, a sword might become a spear, a lever, or a hammer, depending on need.
A knight on the ground is still dangerous, but he is no longer geometrically superior. The fall changes the whole tactical relationship.
Europe learned that some anti-knight combat begins less like fencing and more like hauling a machine into failure. When the knight finally lost height, movement, and space, the smallest weapon often became the most feared.
The dagger was not glorious. It was final.
The battle's most important lesson may be that knights often die only after they stop looking like knights. Europe did not solve the knight with one invention, but with a chain of solutions.
To kill knights reliably, the battlefield learned to think in phases rather than moments.
The goal was not only to pierce armor, but to force the knight into conditions where armor stopped being enough.
One knight was expensive. The answer to him had to be affordable to communities and states. Europe learned that killing knights was partly a manufacturing problem.
The knight belonged to a culture of elite excellence. The counter belonged to a culture of coordinated competence. Wealthy towns often did not outnoble the knight. They out-organized him.
No single innovation ended knightly power.
What changed was the number of environments in which it no longer felt absolute.
Europe's anti-knight education is written most clearly in combined formations.
The battlefield learned to strip away the knight's advantages one by one, until only the man remained. Some answers to the knight came from refined dueling arts. Others came from disciplined crowds with long wood. The knight remained dangerous, even while Europe was learning how to kill him more often.
The anti-knight arsenal looks strange, only if you forget the problem it was built to solve.
Europe had not fully defeated knightly violence until ordinary men stopped believing it was undefeatable. Knights became killable when battle made them solve too many difficulties at once. Europe's real answer to the knight was cumulative, not singular. Once useful methods appear on battlefields, they do not remain secret for long.
Rich towns and poor levies answered the knight differently, but both learned the same direction of truth.
If you read the field after battle, you can see how Europe killed knights by sequence, not miracle. Weapons alone do not kill knights. Formations, timing, and patience teach them how. By now, the battlefield does not merely resist the knight.
The more Europe learned, the fewer clean victories cavalry could buy with shock alone.
The anti-knight lesson moves from distance to intimacy with ruthless logic.
A battlefield changes era when the armored elite starts to doubt the old automatic superiority of its own approach.
The decline of knightly certainty was also the rise of new kinds of disciplined military labor.
Europe did not stop admiring the knight immediately, but it slowly stopped trusting him as the only serious answer. Even other elites learned specific ways to kill armored men, while common infantry learned collective ones.
The strangest weapons are usually just the newest answers to familiar dangers.
Learning to kill knights did not erase them. It erased their certainty.
The new confidence was not aristocratic grandeur, but layered practicality shared by many hands.
The knight became killable when Europe stopped meeting him where he was strongest. Once enough tools and formations align against the knight, the battlefield itself becomes his lesson.
Europe did not discover a simple off-switch for armor. It learned instead how to raise the cost of mounted power.
The first time men survive the night, they learn a new kind of courage for the second.
What one battle teaches, the next often institutionalizes.
Eventually, the anti-knight answer ceases to be desperate invention and becomes military routine. Whether by thrust, hook, fall, or force, Europe kept arriving at the same truth. Armor always leaves some path open.
Knights did not lose certainty only to weapons, but to towns, workshops, and organized production.
Anti-knight warfare did not belong only to open fields. Walls taught it their own harsh vocabulary. Once communities learned what actually threatened armor, they bought accordingly.
The knight remains noble, armed, and dangerous, but no longer universally unquestioned.
Threaten at range, deny the charge, damage the shape, unhorse the rider, overwhelm the body, finish the gaps.
Once the anti-knight lesson matures, power on the field becomes less singular and more negotiated.
The older aristocratic toolkit now faces a broader, cheaper, and more systematized reply.
The knight loses some of his terror when the earth refuses to support his ideal approach.
As Europe learns to kill knights, knightly warfare itself is forced to become less singularly mounted and absolute.
One scale solves the knight with skill and specialization. The other solves him with numbers and discipline.
Before knights could be killed more often, they had to be feared less automatically.
Slow him, spoil him, unhorse him, close him, and finish where steel cannot fully continue.
The future of killing knights was often stacked in plain racks inside practical walls.
By this stage, the true contest is not man against man, but mounted elite system against disciplined anti-mounted system.
The battlefield changed when enough ordinary hands learned enough of the right work.
The knight remained terrifying, but Europe had become increasingly literate in his weaknesses.
One sign that Europe had learned to kill knights was that armored privilege.
Once learned, anti-knight logic entered walls, towns, workshops, and civic planning.
Smiths and carpenters kept refining the answer, because soldiers kept returning with the same hard lessons.
Learning to kill knights was one part of a broader education in more complex, organized violence.
Europe never made the knight irrelevant overnight. It made him answerable.
The final lesson was psychological. Men no longer had to admire the thing they intended to kill.
Strange weapons become normal when enough survivors trust them a second time.